On the evening of October 22nd, 1963, a 17-year-old high school senior named Karen Mitchell was sitting in the living room of a ranch house in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, trying to get two children to sleep, when she noticed something unusual about the bookshelf in Dr. Robert Henshaw's study. The house sat in a residential neighborhood where identical homes lined streets with names like Atomic Avenue and Manhattan Circle, streets that existed only because of what happened in this town during World War II and what continued to happen there nearly 2 decades later. Oak Ridge was not an ordinary American suburb. It was a planned city built in secret during the Manhattan Project, and in the fall of 1963, it remained one of the most classified locations in the United States, a place where thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians worked on nuclear research behind fences and security checkpoints that most Americans knew existed but preferred not to think about too carefully. Karen had been babysitting for the Henshaws for almost 6 months, ever since her mother, who worked as a secretary at the Y-12 National Security Complex, had mentioned that a scientist named Dr. Henshaw and his wife were looking for someone reliable to watch their 2 children on Friday nights. The job paid well, $2 an hour, which was more than most babysitting gigs, and the Henshaws were easy to work for. Dr. Henshaw was polite, but distant, the kind of man who wore glasses and spoke in careful sentences, and his wife Catherine was warm and organized, always leaving detailed instructions about bedtime routines and emergency phone numbers taped to the refrigerator. Their children, Michael, who was 5, and Sarah, who was 7, were well-behaved and usually asleep by 8:30, leaving Karen with several hours to do homework or watch television before the Henshaws returned home around 11. But on this particular Friday evening, October 22nd, Karen found herself unable to concentrate on the algebra homework she had spread across the coffee table. The children had gone to bed without incident. The house was quiet, and she had turned on the television only to find that regular programming had been interrupted by news coverage of something happening in Cuba. President Kennedy was scheduled to address the nation at 7 o'clock, and the broadcasters were using words like crisis and missiles and Soviet Union with a frequency that made Karen increasingly uneasy. She had been 12 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous October, old enough to remember the fear that had settled over Oak Ridge like fog, the way adults had spoken in hushed tones, and how her teachers had conducted extra civil defense drills, though everyone understood that in a town like Oak Ridge, where nuclear materials were produced and stored, civil defense drills were largely performative. If the Soviets launched a nuclear attack, Oak Ridge would be a primary target, and no amount of ducking under desks would matter. The broadcast continued with speculation and analysis while Karen waited for the president's address, and it was during one of these lulls, while a reporter was describing the movement of Soviet ships toward Cuba, that she stood up to stretch her legs and walked toward the hallway that led to Dr. Henshaw's study. She had been in the study before, usually just to retrieve a book or magazine that Mrs. Henshaw had mentioned, and she knew it was a small room lined with bookshelves, dominated by a large wooden desk where Dr. Henshaw presumably worked when he brought materials home from the lab. The door was usually closed, but tonight it stood slightly ajar, and through the opening, Karen could see the green glow of a desk lamp that had been left on. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, intending only to turn off the lamp to save electricity, a habit her parents had instilled in her during years of careful budgeting. But as she reached for the lamp's switch, her attention was caught by something on the desk, a manila folder lying open, its contents partially visible in the circle of light. The folder was thick, perhaps 2 inches of paper, and the top page bore a red stamp that read, "Secret" in block letters across the header and footer, with additional markings she didn't immediately understand. Series of letters and numbers that meant nothing to her, but that carried the unmistakable weight of official classification. Karen stood frozen for several seconds, her hand still extended toward the lamp. She knew enough about Oak Ridge to understand that classified documents were not supposed to leave secure facilities, that there were rules and protocols governing the handling of such materials, and that what she was looking at represented a serious breach of security procedures. Her first instinct was to simply turn off the lamp and leave the room, to pretend she had seen nothing and return to her homework as if this moment had never occurred. But something stopped her from following that instinct. Perhaps it was the news broadcast still playing in the living room, the talk of missiles and crisis, and the possibility of nuclear war. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, the natural human impulse to look at something you've been told not to look at. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, a vague sense that what was happening on that desk in that study, in that house in Oak Ridge, might somehow be connected to the larger events unfolding on the television screen. She moved closer to the desk, close enough to read the text on the top page, and what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. The document was titled, "Technical Assessment of U-2 Reconnaissance Data. Soviet R-12, Medium-Range Ballistic Missile Systems, Deployed in Cuba." The date at the top of the page read October 18, 1963, just 4 days earlier. Below the title were several paragraphs of dense technical text describing missile specifications, range calculations, payload, capacities, and deployment timelines. There were diagrams, cross-sectional drawings of missile components labeled with measurements and technical terminology that Karen couldn't fully comprehend, but that conveyed a clear message. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, missiles capable of reaching most of the eastern United States, and someone in Oak Ridge had been analyzing the intelligence gathered about those missiles. Karen stepped back from the desk, her mind racing. She understood now why President Kennedy was addressing the nation tonight, why the news broadcasts had been using words like crisis and Soviet threat. The missiles were real, they were operational or close to it, and the United States government was preparing some kind of response. What she didn't understand was why this document, clearly classified at a level that should have required it to remain in a secure facility, was sitting on a desk in a residential home where anyone, including a 17-year-old babysitter, could walk in and read it. The question of what to do next paralyzed her for a moment. She could leave the room immediately, turn off the lamp, close the door, and never mention this to anyone. That was the safest option, the one that would cause the least disruption to her life and to the Henshaw's life. But that option also meant pretending she hadn't seen evidence of a security violation that could, in theory, be exploited by foreign intelligence services. Oak Ridge was a target for Soviet espionage. Everyone who lived there knew that. There had been cases over the years of individuals arrested for passing information to the Soviets, stories that circulated through the community as cautionary tales about the importance of vigilance and proper security procedures. What if someone else saw this document? What if Dr. Henshaw had left it accessible not through carelessness, but through something worse, through intentional compromise? Karen's hands were shaking as she backed away from the desk and returned to the living room. President Kennedy's address had begun, and she sat down on the couch to watch, though she could barely focus on his words. The president was describing the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba, confirming what she had just read in the classified document in Dr. Henshaw's study. He spoke of a naval quarantine, of military preparations, of the need for resolve in the face of Soviet aggression. The gravity in his voice matched the fear she had felt looking at those technical diagrams and range calculations, The cold realization that nuclear war was not a distant possibility, but a present danger. Something that could begin within days or hours if the crisis was not managed correctly. When the Henshaws returned home at 11:15, Karen was still sitting on the couch, her algebra homework untouched on the coffee table. Dr. Henshaw walked in first, carrying his coat over one arm, his expression tired but not particularly concerned. Mrs. Henshaw followed, asking the usual questions about how the children had behaved and whether Karen needed a ride home. Karen answered automatically, saying the children had been fine, had gone to bed on time, that everything had been quiet. She took the money Mrs. Henshaw offered her, 5 $1 bills and some change, and said she could walk home since it was only 3 blocks, and the night was clear. She didn't mention the document. She didn't mention the study, or the open folder, or the red secret stamp. She simply put on her jacket, said goodnight, and walked out into the October darkness, her mind churning with indecision and fear. The walk home took less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer. Each step weighted with the question of what she should do with the information she had accidentally acquired. By the time she reached her own house, a nearly identical ranch home 3 streets over, she had made a decision. She would tell her mother in the morning. Her mother worked at Y12, had a security clearance, would know the proper channels for reporting this kind of incident without causing unnecessary panic or making accusations that might be unfounded. Dr. Henshaw might have a perfectly legitimate reason for having that document at home, some kind of authorization that Karen wasn't aware of. Or he might have simply forgotten it was there, a momentary lapse in judgment rather than intentional compromise. Her mother would know how to handle it. But when Karen woke up on Saturday morning, October 23rd, the house was already filled with tension. Her father was at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and the headline screamed in large type about the naval blockade of Cuba and the possibility of armed conflict with Soviet ships. Her mother was listening to the radio, and the broadcaster was describing military mobilizations and emergency preparations. The entire nation seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether the crisis would escalate into war or somehow be diffused through negotiation. In that atmosphere, the thought of approaching her mother about a security violation at the Henshaw house felt simultaneously more urgent and more impossible. What if reporting it triggered some kind of investigation that distracted people from the larger crisis? What if Dr. Henshaw was arrested or lost his security clearance at a moment when every scientist and engineer in Oak Ridge was needed to support whatever response the government was preparing? Karen spent most of that Saturday in her room, trying to do homework but mostly listening to radio updates and wrestling with her conscience. By Sunday morning, when it became clear that the crisis was not resolving quickly, that Soviet ships were still approaching the quarantine line, and that military forces on both sides were at high alert, she made a different decision. She would go to the FBI field office in Knoxville and report what she had seen. Not to her mother, not to school officials, not to anyone who might feel conflicted about taking action against a neighbor or colleague, but directly to federal authorities whose job it was to handle exactly this kind of security matter. The FBI field office in Knoxville was located in a nondescript office building downtown, and when Karen walked in on Monday afternoon after school, having taken the bus from Oak Ridge without telling her parents where she was going, the receptionist looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Karen was still wearing her school clothes, a skirt and blouse that suddenly felt childish in this environment of serious adults conducting serious business. She told the receptionist she needed to report a potential security violation involving classified documents, and after a moment of hesitation, the receptionist picked up a phone and made a call. 20 minutes later, Karen was sitting in a small interview room across from two FBI agents, a man named Special Agent Thomas Crawford and a woman named Special Agent Helen Morrison. They listened without interrupting as Karen described what she had seen in Dr. Henshaw's study on Friday night. The classified folder lying open on the desk, the technical assessment of Soviet missiles in Cuba, the date and title and classification markings. When she finished, Agent Crawford asked several careful questions about the exact wording of the document header, about the location of the house, about Dr. Henshaw's employment, about whether Karen had touched anything or photographed anything or told anyone else what she had seen. Karen answered truthfully. She had touched nothing, photographed nothing, told no one. She had simply walked into a room to turn off a lamp and had seen something that she believed should be reported. Agent Morrison asked her why she had waited until Monday to come forward, and Karen explained her initial uncertainty, her fear of causing problems unnecessarily, her hope that there might be some innocent explanation. But over the weekend, as she had listened to news reports about the crisis and thought about the implications of classified materials being left unsecured in a residential home, she had concluded that whatever personal discomfort or social consequences might result from reporting this, they were less important than ensuring that security protocols were being followed at a time of national emergency. The FBI agents thanked her for coming forward and told her that they would investigate the matter, that she should not discuss this with anyone, including her parents or friends, and that someone might contact her again if additional information was needed. They drove her back to Oak Ridge and dropped her off a block from her house, and Karen went inside feeling both relieved that she had done what she believed was right and terrified about what might happen next. What happened next unfolded over the course of several weeks, though Karen wouldn't learn most of the details until much later. The FBI immediately opened an investigation into Dr. Robert Henshaw, conducting a review of his security file, his access permissions, his recent activities, and his contacts both inside and outside the Oak Ridge facility. What they discovered was not evidence of espionage or intentional compromise, but rather a pattern of carelessness that had been overlooked or minimized by his supervisors because of his technical expertise and his importance to ongoing weapons research programs. Dr. Henshaw, it turned out, had a history of taking classified documents home to review, a practice that violated security protocols, but that he justified by arguing that he needed uninterrupted time to analyze complex technical data, time that was difficult to find during normal working hours when he was constantly interrupted by meetings and administrative duties. His supervisors at the Y-12 facility had been aware of this practice, but had not taken formal action to stop it, partly because Henshaw was considered valuable, and partly because enforcing strict document control procedures would have required confronting a senior scientist who had been with the Manhattan Project since its earliest days. But Karen's report had come at a moment when the government could not afford to tolerate any security lapses, however well-intentioned or historically tolerated they might have been. The Cuban Missile Crisis had exposed the vulnerability of American intelligence systems and had raised questions about whether classified information was being adequately protected from Soviet espionage efforts. In that environment, a 17-year-old babysitter walking into a study and finding a secret-level document about Soviet missile capabilities sitting on an unsecured desk was exactly the kind of incident that could not be ignored or explained away. On November 4, 1963, 2 weeks after Karen's visit to the FBI field office, and several days after the Cuban Missile Crisis had been resolved through a negotiated agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, Dr. Robert Henshaw was called into a meeting with his supervisors and informed that his security clearance was being suspended pending a full investigation into his handling of classified materials. He was placed on administrative leave, required to surrender his access badges, and told that he would not be permitted to return to Y-12 until the investigation was completed. The news spread through Oak Ridge quickly, the way news always spread in a small community where everyone knew everyone else, and where the boundaries between professional and personal life were porous. Within days, people were asking questions about what Henshaw had done, whether he had been passing information to the Soviets, whether there was a spy ring operating in Oak Ridge. The rumors were fueled partly by genuine concern and partly by the same Cold War paranoia that had led to McCarthyism a decade earlier, the tendency to see betrayal and conspiracy in every deviation from perfect loyalty. Karen heard the rumors at school, where classmates whose parents worked at the National Lab were repeating stories they had overheard at home. She said nothing, honoring the FBI's instruction not to discuss what she had seen or reported. But she felt a growing sense of guilt and responsibility. She had set these events in motion by going to the FBI, and now Dr. Henshaw's career and reputation were being destroyed, his family subjected to scrutiny and suspicion, all because he had left a document on his desk in his own home. The investigation concluded in early December with a finding that Dr. Henshaw had repeatedly violated security protocols by removing classified documents from Y-12 without proper authorization and by failing to store those documents in approved containers while they were in his possession. The report noted that there was no evidence of intentional compromise, no indication that he had shared classified information with unauthorized individuals or had any contact with foreign intelligence services, but the violations were serious enough that the recommendation was made to permanently revoke his security clearance and terminate his employment. Dr. Henshaw appealed the decision, arguing that his violations had been motivated by a desire to serve his country more effectively, that he had never endangered national security, and that the punishment was disproportionate to the offense. But the appeal was denied. In the atmosphere following the Cuban Missile Crisis, with heightened attention to security procedures and zero tolerance for careless handling of classified information, there was no room for leniency or second chances. By January 1964, Dr. Henshaw had left Oak Ridge. He found a position teaching physics at a small college in upstate New York, a job that did not require a security clearance and that represented a significant step down from his previous work on cutting-edge nuclear weapons research. His wife and children moved with him, leaving behind the only community they had known, and the house on Atomic Avenue was rented to a new family, scientists or engineers brought in to replace Henshaw and others who had been caught in the post-crisis security crackdown. Karen Mitchell graduated from high school in the spring of 1964 and enrolled at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She never babysat for another family in Oak Ridge, partly because she no longer needed the money after receiving a scholarship, and partly because the experience with the Henshaws had left her with a complicated mixture of feelings that she couldn't entirely process or articulate. She had done what she believed was right, had reported a security violation that could theoretically have been exploited by foreign intelligence services. But the cost of that decision had been borne primarily by Dr. Henshaw and his family, people who had treated her kindly and who had, in all likelihood, committed no crime beyond being careless with paperwork in the privacy of their own home. The question of whether she had made the right choice would stay with her for years. In some versions of the story, she told herself, she was a responsible citizen who had prevented a potential security breach at a critical moment in American history. In other versions, she was a teenager who had overreacted to something she didn't fully understand and had destroyed a man's career in the process. The truth, as she came to realize over time, was probably somewhere between those extremes, in that murky space where good intentions and imperfect information collide to produce consequences that no one fully anticipated or desired. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without nuclear war, and the immediate fear that had gripped the nation in October 1963 gradually faded into the background anxiety that defined life during the Cold War. But the crisis left lasting impacts on American security procedures, on the way classified information was handled, on the oversight mechanisms put in place to prevent careless practices from becoming systemic vulnerabilities. Dr. Henshaw's case became one of dozens cited in internal government reviews as evidence that security culture needed to be strengthened, that even trusted scientists with decades of service could not be permitted to treat classified documents casually. Karen Mitchell never spoke publicly about her role in initiating the investigation that ended Dr. Henshaw's career. The FBI had asked her to maintain confidentiality, and she honored that request throughout her life. She went on to earn a degree in library science, worked for several decades as a reference librarian at the University of Tennessee, and raised 2 children who never knew that their mother had once walked into a study in Oak Ridge and found a classified document that changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Dr. Robert Henshaw died in 1987 at the age of 68, having spent the last 23 years of his career teaching undergraduate physics and conducting unclassified research that, by his own admission in private correspondence, felt anticlimactic after the intensity and importance of his work on nuclear weapons programs. His obituary made no mention of Oak Ridge or his termination from Y-12, describing him only as a dedicated teacher and researcher who had made significant contributions to his field. The house on Atomic Avenue in Oak Ridge still stands, though the neighborhood has changed in the decade since 1963. The streets with names like Manhattan Circle are now just ordinary suburban roads where ordinary families live ordinary lives, most of them with no connection to the nuclear research that still continues behind fences at Y-12 and the other facilities that define this city's identity and purpose. The study where Karen Mitchell saw that classified folder has been renovated multiple times, and whatever significance that room once held has been erased by fresh paint and new furniture and the passage of time that turns history into background noise. But the incident itself remains part of the historical record, preserved in FBI files that were partially declassified in the 1990s, and that provide one small window into how the Cold War was fought, not just between nations, but within them, in the daily negotiations between security and convenience, between trust and verification, between the need to protect secrets and the human tendency to cut corners when tired or overworked, or convinced that the rules don't really apply to circumstances as exceptional as one's own. Karen Mitchell's decision to report what she saw that Friday night in October 1963 was neither heroic nor villainous. It was simply a choice made by a young person trying to do the right thing in a situation where the right thing was not entirely clear, where competing loyalties and incomplete information created ambiguity that could only be resolved by taking action and accepting whatever consequences followed. In that sense, her story is not fundamentally about nuclear secrets or Cold War espionage, but about the weight of responsibility that falls on ordinary individuals when they find themselves, through accident or circumstance, in possession of knowledge they never sought and never wanted, knowledge that demands a response even when every possible response carries its own burden of doubt and regret.